Alrighty, you guys, I guess this will be pod 45 since my Rafi Devers trade pod was apparently pod 44, so that's math for you. Looks like the Red Sox have gotten the better of that situation, so interesting developments. Hopefully they continue to play well after the All-Star break. However, for this time, my interest is in essentially the recent developments with respect to essentially the Department of Justice's statements about Jeffrey Epstein, the lack of existence of a client list, essentially spiking the case like a football. And so I'm going to respond essentially to a particular audio clip from Donald Trump the other day, essentially asking who cares about Jeffrey Epstein? The case is sordid and boring. Why are we focusing on it? And so I think, first of all, that's intentionally nonsensical. He knows exactly why people would be interested in Epstein. And but anyway, let's not waste too much time talking about conflicts of interest and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's focus more on the facts of the matter, and we can kind of run through this basically, because I did this the other day doing a little bit of reading on it. Just go read Jeffrey Epstein's Wikipedia page and, go through. You don't have to essentially watch those longer documentaries where, who knows necessarily the quality of it. Let's just roll through some very basic level biographical information, because I think the dismissal of this guy as being a nobody or somebody who is essentially, it's like, don't look over there, I think is nonsensical. So let me play that little bit of audio so that we can know what I'm talking about. Here we go.
I don't understand why the Jeffrey Epstein case would be of interest to anybody. It's pretty boring stuff. It's sordid, but it's boring. And I don't understand why it keeps going. I think, really only pretty bad people, including fake news, want to keep something like that going. But credible information, let them give it. Anything that's credible, I would say, let them have it. But I don't understand.
All right, so picking back up after that. So the question is kind of, why would anybody be interested in Jeffrey Epstein? And so to kind of quickly answer the question and sort of orient the discussion in a way, I think it's important to understand essentially his financial background and why essentially he might not have been a financial genius of any particular sort, but he was certainly involved seemingly in the subprime mortgage crisis and worked at Bear Stearns, which, if you know anything about that, they were basically the flagship of watching the economy go down in flames during the financial crisis. And so basically what's always been the interesting part about Epstein is the fact of his seeming lack of any sort of serious credentials, yet his ability to insert himself, I'm not making a pun there, but into various social circles, and essentially, why was this the case? And one of the kind of directions that this sort of discussion goes into is essentially thinking of Epstein as a spy master of some sort, or he's an asset of Mossad, or he was a CIA agent, or some silly shit like this. And that's frankly not my contention. That's not the way that I would understand this matter, and that's partially because of a lack of complete definitive knowledge of the subject, and also the fact that if he were to have had a role in the intelligence agencies of any particular country, that would be the sort of thing that obviously those intelligence agencies would they would obfuscate, and they would not be transparent about that sort of thing. And so, part of the matter seems to be that the speculation about him being a spy comes from two places, really. Number one, it seems apparent if you read about him that he was essentially bragging to people about his connections to that sort of world. And then if you go and you listen to some of the people talk about his ability to know about certain people's mathematical research, his connections to the Harvard University mathematics department, etc. Again, despite the fact that he started his professional career as a teacher at the Dalton School, hired by Bill Barr's father, despite lacking a college degree, and then he was dismissed from the school, apparently because he was being a creep. And then this is when sort of his banking and finance world sort of starts, where he's working at Bear Stearns and other places, including apparently participating in a massive $450 million Ponzi scheme. So, right off the bat there, when, especially with the Ponzi scheme that he was allegedly involved with, where Towers Financial Corporation, 1993, imploded when it was exposed as one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history, losing over $250 million of its investors' money, equivalent to almost $1 trillion in 2024. In court documents, Hoffenberg, who is his partner in this, claimed that Epstein was intimately involved in the scheme. Epstein left the company by 1989 and was never charged for involvement in the massive investor fraud committed. It's unknown if Epstein acquired any stolen funds from the Towers Ponzi scheme. So, right there, just right off the bat, and I'm going to be talking with this attitude the whole time, so if you don't like it, you don't like it, and I don't care. But Donald Trump is a fucking moron, and he asks stupid questions, and if you're asking why people are interested in Jeffrey Epstein, and it's a genuine question that you're curious why people care, you're uninformed or stupid, because right off the bat, this guy is either involved in Ponzi schemes, or he's involved in corporations that eventually devolve into Ponzi schemes, and his partners are definitely allege that he was involved in that. So there's that aspect of it where just from a financial perspective, the story of how Epstein had his money is incredibly unclear. And so given that lack of clarity, I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to be asking the question, essentially, who was this guy? And so while those things are seemingly relatively unclear, I think, because you look at his career as a quote-unquote financier later on. What did he do? He essentially handled the estate of Les Wexner, the Victoria's Secrets guy, or wherever he's from, but that guy, who's essentially a massive rich person in Ohio, shout out to the Pat McAfee show, they mention him all the time, but so he basically put that guy's estate back in order, which helped him get his money straight. And so Epstein probably was benefiting substantially through fees for managing private clients. And so to sort of dive into what private clients group work is not really necessary here for the purpose of this discussion. All you have to know is you have private clients, and obviously the reason why anybody with a business mind is associating with private clients is for financial reasons. Like, don't be a mark. they're not doing this for, out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it for financial reasons. So yeah, Leslie Wexner, CEO of L Brands and Victoria's Secret. So in July 1991, Wexner granted Epstein full power of attorney over his affairs, managed wealth, various projects, including building his yacht, the Limitless. And so, just from a financial perspective with, Epstein, 1996, changed the name of his firm to Financial Trust Company for tax advantages, based it on the island of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, was able to reduce his federal income taxes by 90%. So, when we're talking today about growing wealth and income inequality, the idea that you would plug your ears, cover your eyes and say, I don't see anything here for Jeffrey Epstein. It's like this guy is essentially on the ground floor of the massive transfer of wealth from the lower and middle classes of the United States up into the very few. And it essentially raises the question, what is these people's merit? How do they deserve any of the money that they essentially appropriated, especially when you talk about them, Towers Financial Corporation, essentially being corporate raiders, and then, the fact that it was a Ponzi scheme, etc. The matter seems to be that these sorts of things happened quite a bit in the 1980s, 1990s, etc. And that's obviously no coincidence. That's obviously in part due to the Reagan administration, etc., kind of rolling on through and allowing these people to do these sort of things. And then you go through to the Clinton years where this stuff is obviously continuing. And, right, like we all know, Jeffrey Epstein was associated with Bill Clinton. There's no question about that. Also associated with George Stephanopoulos and others. So, this is, nobody can say that Epstein was, completely in the pocket of one political party or only doing things for one political party. And the vast majority of his donations were to Democratic candidates. He did donate to Republican candidates as well. But obviously you can have this sort of situation where your stated politics might be a certain way because you essentially appreciate the sort of kleptocracy that has been put in place since the Reagan administration. So, and some people might refer to that quite loosely as neoliberalism. And so we can leave that right there. But again, that's another thing where, just saying that, who cares? It's just a sordid story of Jeffrey Epstein. It's like, no, the sordid story is, when, and the whole thing of his sexual predation is sordid stories, especially, the stuff he was doing at the Dalton School, where he was behaving inappropriately towards underage female students, paying them constant attention, even showing up at a party where young people were drinking, according to a former student, and was dismissed from Dalton for poor performance, and then became acquainted with Alan Greenberg, Chief Executive Officer of Bear Stearns. And again, remember, Bear Stearns is basically they're the ones in The Big Short that their CEO is on stage saying, I would continue to buy even as their stock price crashed. And so Epstein gets hired seemingly on the basis of no real credentials other than maybe he was essentially like a genius math student, right? And that's kind of that could be easy enough to assume. I don't even know if it's necessary to essentially assume he was good at math himself. I don't know what that necessarily gets us in terms of this analysis. So I don't know how relevant his mathematical skill is, other than it would help to explain how he got a job teaching physics and mathematics to teens in Manhattan. But then, how he could have moved through Bear Stearns, starting, low-level junior assistant to a floor trader, became an options trader, advising the bank's wealthiest clients, such as Seagram President Edgar Bronfman, on tax mitigation strategies, and Jimmy Kane, the bank's later chief executive officer, praised Epstein's skill with wealthy clients and complex products. Now, and he was also in 1981, he was asked to leave Bear Stearns for being guilty of a Reg D violation. So when somebody says, somebody is skilled with wealthy clients and complex products, that's a complex statement. Because to say they're skilled in that, again, are you just skilled in that because you're good at math? Like, what's the deal? How are you good at these things? And so, remember there was two parts to this big question of why anybody cares about Epstein. The second part was his alleged ties to intelligence agencies, and essentially the fact that when he was finally brought up on charges the first time by Alexander Acosta, Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney in Miami, entered into direct discussions about a plea agreement with Jeffrey Epstein right around the time that Bear Stearns started to fail. And Acosta brokered a lenient deal, according to him, because he had been ordered by higher government officials who told him Epstein was an individual of importance to the government. And so, one of these stories that's coming up in the footnotes here for Wikipedia is it sure looks like Jeffrey Epstein was a spy, but whose? And that's from 2019 New York Observer, so I'm not going to read that whole article, but it says, as part of the negotiations, according to the Miami Herald, Epstein provided unspecified information to the Florida federal prosecutors for a more lenient sentence and was supposedly an unnamed key witness for the New York federal prosecutors in their unsuccessful June 2008 criminal case against the two managers of the failed Bear Stearns hedge fund. Alan Dershowitz, one of Epstein's Florida attorneys on the case, told Fox Business Network, "We would have been touting that if he had cooperated. The idea that Epstein helped in any prosecution is news to me." So, yes, so let's go down here to this non-prosecution agreement, because we're going to do some skipping around here, because quite frankly, if you don't know who Jeff Epstein is, like, if you've never heard that name before, it might be time for you to get out under that rock you live out under and essentially understand that, this guy was given a lenient plea deal and was essentially treated as if he was subject to a different standard of justice than other people. And according again to Alexander Acosta, U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, Acosta later said he offered a lenient plea deal because he was told that Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence, was, quote, above his pay grade, and to, quote, leave it alone. Epstein agreed to plead guilty in a Florida state case to 2 felony prostitution charges, serve 18 months in prison, register as a sex offender, and pay restitution of the 36 victims identified by the FBI. This plea deal was later described as a sweetheart deal. A federal judge later found that the prosecutors had violated the victims' rights by concealing the agreement from the victims and instead urging them to have patience. According to an internal review conducted by the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility released in 2020, Acosta showed poor judgment in granting Epstein a non-prosecution agreement and failing to notify Epstein's alleged victims about the agreement. So I'm not going to get into the fact that when he was, like, you heard what I said. They took the charges from federal, they made them state charges, they pleaded everything down, and his 18 months in jail was a joke, so, or prison rather, was a joke. And so this is absolutely correctly identified as a sweetheart deal and a lenient plea deal. And so for Donald Trump to say, I don't know why people care about Jeffrey Epstein, let me quote Alexander Acosta, again, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida at the time, who said, Jeffrey Epstein belonged to intelligence, was above his pay grade, and leave it alone. So, what do we know from this? What we know from this is that the federal attorney for the Southern District of Florida was told that because Jeffrey Epstein was connected to intelligence, and this is not specific to which intelligence service, so again, we have two prime suspects. I don't think anybody's saying that he was an MI6 officer, so it's either CIA or Mossad. And so, you combine that with the fact that during the 1980s, essentially, he had a passport that listed his primary residence as being in Saudi Arabia, and he was marked numerous times in the passport for entering various countries. And supposedly the reason for this is because as a Jewish person traveling, he was subject to certain threats, and so by listing himself as living in Saudi Arabia, he was protecting himself in some way. You can decide for yourself whether you take that seriously or not. But to say he belonged to intelligence, again, whether that's CIA or Mossad, the fundamental question comes up to be like, who cares? Like, good for you belongs to the CIA. And then you think about it for 2 more seconds and you realize the CIA was probably partially responsible for the Kennedy assassination. And then you stop wondering why people accuse the CIA of everything under the sun. It's because, Project MKUltra, these people were brainwashing people, trying to find mind control drugs. Like, you have to understand, this is the sort of organization that this was. And the idea is essentially they murdered Kennedy because Kennedy was going to cut their budget. You can choose to believe that or not. But, who killed JFK? That was supposedly another list of files that's on Pam Bondi's desk. I wonder if she'll spike that case too. But so to say he belongs to intelligence, again, what does that mean? And this is what's unclear, and this is where I think a lot of people in their imaginations start to let the imaginations run away with them a little bit. And so this is an example where, so if we say Jeffrey Epstein belonged to intelligence, there's a range of possibilities here. There's a possibility that he was an asset in the sense of he was somebody who was utilized by intelligence services, not that he was an agent himself, but that he was essentially a pawn on the chessboard being used by more powerful people for whatever purpose. And again, this is speculation on speculation, but to say that Jeffrey Epstein belongs to intelligence was above his pay grade, we're obviously not talking about pay grade in the literal sense that Alexander Acosta, as U.S. Attorney for Southern District of Florida, was making less money than Jeffrey Epstein. Above his pay grade means Jeffrey Epstein outranked, in some sense, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. Now, I don't know if we should be living in a society, essentially, where rich people get to just be above the law, above his pay grade, essentially. That's what that means. and that's why he had to leave it alone. And so, you know, why are people interested in Jeffrey Epstein? Well, because quite frankly, I'd like to drag Alexander Acosta in front of Congress, put him under oath, and ask him a lot of specific questions about what happened with this non-prosecution agreement. Why was this offered? Is there anybody above your pay grade who told you to do this? Who told you he belonged to intelligence? What does that consist? Like, I want all that information because, you know, that's not good enough. And just this idea that kind of under the surface, hidden under the rug, it's like, oh, well, we all know that rich people are above the law. Just look at O.J. Simpson. And it's like, okay, if this is the society that we're aspiring to live in, where rich people are above the law, then again, I want to raise the question, who does this benefit? And if it doesn't benefit the vast majority of people, the vast majority of people need to get their fucking act together from a democratic perspective, start to recognize that people like Jeffrey Epstein have essentially robbed them blind for like 50 years. So you ask, why does anybody care about him? Is because this guy with no apparent qualifications beyond allegedly being good at math was able to essentially appropriate such a large amount of money for himself that people are making up all sorts of conspiracy theories trying to make him out to be James fucking Bond or some shit like this. And I don't believe that he was that important. What I believe, if I were to state my sort of opinion, broadly speaking, on this matter, I would say it's likely that he was an asset of at least one, if not more than one, intelligence agencies. I'm not particularly interested in the speculation of whether it's Mossad or CIA, simply because I think if you go with the assumption that it was Mossad, your only real evidence is essentially his involvement with those IDF people in 2015 and probably before then. But you know, it's not impossible that he was an asset of Mossad. The only tricky part, and this is the tricky part, is when you're talking about this, you always want to be sensitive to the notion that you're not just going to immediately associate a Jewish person who, if I have the facts of this right, he's born in Brooklyn, so, you know, whether Jeffrey Epstein was Jewish, his parents were Jewish, but that, you know, that does not constitute grounds for he was a Mossad agent just because he is Jewish. And so I want to make that incredibly clear. But that being said, there is evidence essentially that he was involved in matters with certain IDF people. I'd have to find, yeah. So, 2015, the Israeli paper Haaretz reported that Epstein invested in the startup Reporty Homeland Security, rebranded as Carbine 2018. Startup was connected with Israel's defense industry, headed by former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who was also at one time the defense minister and chief of staff of the IDF. CEO of the company is Amir Elahai, special forces operator, and Pinchas Bukris, a director of the company and a former defense ministry director, general, and commander of IDF Cyber Unit 8200. Epstein and Barrak, the head of Carbine, were close, and Epstein often offered him lodging at one of his apartment units at 301 East 66th Street in Manhattan. Epstein had past experience with Israel's research and military sector. In April 2008, he went to Israel and met with a number of research scientists and visited different Israeli military bases. So, like, based on this information alone, there's no proof, right, that he's involved with Mossad. That is that's supposition on supposition, although I think it's essentially the case that Epstein himself bragged that he was associated with intelligence agencies, because I believe when the no, that's the Towers Financial Corporation again. We don't need to. Well, I guess we can look at his financial consulting section here, because in August 1981, Epstein founded his own consulting firm, Intercontinental Assets Group, Inc., which assisted clients in recovering stolen money from fraudulent brokers and lawyers. Interesting. Epstein described his work at the time as being a high-level bounty hunter. So, weird, right? Like, we just let people like this operate in the economy, I guess. He told friends he worked sometimes as a consultant for governments and the very wealthy to recover embezzled funds, while at other times he worked for clients who had embezzled funds. So this is kind of the person who's selling weapons to both sides of the war, so they win either way. And it says Spanish actress and heiress Ana Obregón was one such wealthy client whom Epstein helped in 1982 to recover her father's millions in lost investments, which had disappeared when dry state government securities collapsed because of fraud. And again, so Epstein also stated to some people at the time he was an intelligence agent. During the 1980s, he possessed an Austrian passport that had his photo, but with a false name. The passport showed his residence as Saudi Arabia. In 2017, a former senior White House official reported that Alexander Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, who had handled Epstein's criminal case in 2008, had stated to interviewers of President Trump's first transition team, "I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone, and that Epstein was above his pay grade." Also really interesting. During this period, one of Epstein's clients was Saudi Arabian businessman Adnan Khashoggi, who was the middleman in transferring American weapons from Israel to Iran as part of the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s. Jamal Khashoggi is this guy's nephew. Spoiler alert, the journalist who was unfortunately cut to pieces with a bone saw in Turkey was one of Epstein's clients' nephew. Khashoggi, Adnan Khashoggi, was one of several defense contractors he knew. In the mid-1980s, Epstein traveled multiple times between the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. While in London, Epstein met Stephen Hoffenberg. They had been introduced through Douglas Lease, a defense contractor, and John Mitchell, the former U.S. Attorney General. And this is when Stephen Hoffenberg hires Epstein in 1987 as a consultant for Towers Financial Corporation. So, again, you say, why does anybody care about this guy? Well, it's because this guy was essentially bragging to people that he was a spy. He has an Austrian passport with a false name that shows his residence as being in Saudi Arabia. And the guy who prosecuted him was told Trump's transition team that Epstein belonged to intelligence and leave it alone because he's above his pay grade. So we've got all these situations here where Epstein essentially, describing his work as a high-level bounty hunter, running back and forth between the clients who had their funds embezzled and the people who were embezzling them. Does this sound like a good person to you? And does this sound like a boring, simple story about a guy who just happened to basically be a pedophile? I really don't think so, right? Like, let's use your fucking brain for half a second and just understand that this guy essentially started to negotiate his original surrender when Bear Stearns began to collapse. And so
and I've kind of skipped over this, but let's just state this kind of quickly. Jeffrey Epstein appears to have had his hands all over the subprime mortgage crisis, which once again crushed the United States economy and probably would have killed it if they hadn't been willing to essentially extend the Bush tax cuts, which allowed the country to flag along at the tepid pace of growth that it did. And then, there was no ability essentially to address the increasing wealth and income inequality. So I've heard this sort of analogy from a lot of the Obama people that when you talk about the economy under their stewardship, you have to essentially take into account the financial collapse brought on essentially by the Bush administration, although it's way more complicated than that, but that they were essentially playing cleanup. And the metaphor they use is of an airplane, where they say, if you're flying an airplane and there's a fire on board, but you also need to make a crash landing, you're probably going to invest most of your time into making sure that you land the plane safely first, because if you crash the plane, it doesn't matter if you put the fire out, everybody's dead. This is the analogy where they'll justify all sorts of things, from the bailout of Wall Street to the kind of, again, the sweetheart agreements that a lot of these investment firms got, where they got bailed out and they also got to pay themselves bonuses for whatever fucking reason. And so, they basically got to make all the mistakes, lose the American people's money, and then make the American people pay for it, which caused a huge amount of the debt. And so the United States, federal debt. And so when we think about, these analogies about an airplane and not wanting to crash the plane and all these sorts of things, what that indicates is that the economy underneath was rotten. And maybe not rotten to the core, but rotten in certain fundamental ways. And, you can look at it in an analogous way right now to China's economy, where we're very comfortable writing all sorts of news articles about the fact that their property sector is flagging because, with Evergrande or whichever one of the companies it was that basically defaulted, and et cetera, in the Chinese sort of real estate property market is, again, I guess, in trouble. But then, you look at the United States and you say, however long ago, the average age of the home buyer was sometime in their 20s or 30s, whatever. Now the average age of the American home buyer is in their late 50s or 60s. And, you just think about it and you say, if your main demographic is in their late 50s or their 60s, are you really a long-term viable product? And I think this goes to sort of a larger problem of people seemingly since roughly 1980 have essentially given themselves over to this sort of supply-side economics theory that essentially the United States needs to do everything in our power to avoid inflation, really. And the ways that we're going to avoid that is we're going to offshore lots of jobs. We're going to financialize the economy to a much greater degree. And we're going to do things like creating the subprime mortgage crisis, which are going to create some economic growth in the short term, especially when those sorts of ideas were less problematically oriented, essentially before they started loading in all the bad quality mortgages into it and just throwing them all in one bundle, which, spoiler alert, they're doing the exact same thing right now for cars. The only difference is cars are kind of a lesser asset than housing is relative for an economic perspective. But, you look at a lot of the things that were causing the United States economy to grow in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s. And it's like a lot of that, was based on stuff that seems eerily similar to what Jeffrey Epstein was doing when he was working with private clients, when he was getting money back for embezzling clients or helping the clients who embezzled money, all these sorts of things. We've essentially allowed this sort of monopoly economy to exist where rich people are essentially allowed to have amounts of money that are really nonsensical for them to be able to have. And on the one hand, it enables them to do all sorts of nefarious and, let's use Donald Trump's word, sordid things that frankly would not have been possible had he not been worth so much money. So anybody trying to make the argument that, society should have billionaires, they're good for us, it's like, I really don't think so. And I think this guy is a pretty good example of why not, because essentially they have all these connections and they're above the law. And if you don't believe that, I'd encourage you to look at the facts. Look at the fact that he wasn't charged with federal crimes initially, that he was charged with state crimes, that he was given a slap on the wrist, that he was able to leave his jail for like 12 hours a day during his sentence. Like, there's something that really doesn't add up with Jeffrey Epstein, and I think it's this sort of monopoly money economy where you just let rich people run around with increasing amounts of money, and they're just doing increasingly stupid shit over time. And then you look at it in terms of, does this benefit the American people as a whole? And I would say it does not. And you can disagree with me, but I don't think you're really going to be able to convince anybody that allowing people like Jeffrey Epstein to do what they did, again, with his lack of any seeming sort of actual credentials, his involvement with the subprime mortgage crisis, and the fact that by the time that Bear Stearns fund began to fail in May 2007, Epstein had begun to negotiate a plea deal with the U.S. Attorney's Office concerning imminent charges for sex with minors. And then in August 2007, a month after the fund collapsed, the U.S. Attorney entered into direct discussions about the plea agreement. And like I've said many times, lenient agreement, allegedly because he provided information to people. So this is a whole thing, and I don't want to necessarily continue going through Jeffrey Epstein's whole thing. Like I said, there's documentaries on this, so you can watch and learn more for yourself. But when the President of the United States goes out and he's saying, "Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? That creep? What are you doing?" It's like, hey, buddy, the reason why we're talking about him is the fact that we don't have enough information on his activities. We needed more information, and he didn't go to trial, allegedly because he killed himself. Now, I'm going to say this. If you believe that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself, you have to explain the broken hyoid bone. And do your own research, essentially, on a bone in the neck that is typical of cases of strangulation, is atypical in cases of death by hanging. This is one of the injuries that Jeffrey Epstein sustained during his alleged suicide attempt, is he broke the hyoid bone in his neck. And this was pointed out by an autopsy done by somebody who I think was contracted by the estate. And so when you say that an autopsy report by somebody who potentially had some level of interest in not presenting it as a suicide, you have to sort of take that into acknowledgement. However, from my reading on it, that injury, again, the hyoid bone break, is only really associated with hanging cases where somebody hung themselves from a long drop, essentially. It's what I read, is that that sort of break is atypical of hanging yourself. So, again, how do you establish that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself? Because, first of all, that minute or so that's missing of the camera footage, even if it were to somehow be recovered and doesn't show anybody entering the cell, there's questions about, essentially, number one, this guy about a week or so earlier had allegedly attempted to do something similar, which left him with marks on his neck and yada yada yada, and there was some sort of question essentially among the guards as to whether this was a staged event or not. And then, like a week later, it seemingly happens again. And what the government would seemingly have you believe is that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself, and I'm being graphic here, but he killed himself by violently throwing himself off essentially the top bunk of his bed and kind of violently breaking his own throat, breaking his neck. Now, that's the reason why that's hard to believe, is he just didn't have that much room in the room he was in to believe that his neck broke in the way that it did as the result of hanging. Apparently would have been more consistent with hanging from a lot higher or a greater distance of falling. And I just don't buy as plausible that, well, actually I shouldn't say that. I don't buy as probable that this is what happened, essentially, because I mean, you have to go into such bizarre details of how he, what were the materials from which he hung himself? What's the object from which he hung himself? Was it the bed itself? Was he hanging himself from the bed lining or the sheets? If so, how did he essentially do that successfully? And so I'm going to read this death section really quickly here. So, on July 23rd, 2019, Epstein was found injured and semi-conscious at 1:30 on the floor of his cell with marks around his neck. His cellmate, former New York City police officer Nicholas Taglioni, who was at the time awaiting trial for 4 counts of murder, was questioned about Epstein's condition. He denied having any knowledge about what happened. Correctional staff suspected attempted suicide, but did not rule out the possibility that it was staged or that he was assaulted by another inmate. According to NBC News, 2 sources said that Epstein might have tried to hang himself. A third said injuries were not serious and could have been staged. 4th source said that an assault by his cellmate had not been ruled out. After that incident, he was placed on suicide watch. 6 days later, on July 29th, 2019, Epstein was taken off of suicide watch and placed in special housing unit with another inmate. Epstein's close associates said he was in good spirits. I believe that quote actually comes from Alan Dershowitz, because what Dershowitz was essentially saying was that Epstein had a bail motion in process that for some reason they think they might have been successful with. I don't know why they think that's the case, but again, maybe he has connections and he's above certain people's pay grades. Who knows? But anyway, to continue, when Epstein was placed in a special housing unit, the jail informed the Justice Department that he would have a cellmate and that a guard would look into the cell every 30 minutes. These procedures were not followed on the night of his death. On August 9th, 2019, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out, but no one took his place. Later in the evening, contrary to the jail's normal procedure, Epstein was not checked every 30 minutes. The 2 guards who were assigned to check his jail unit that night fell asleep and did not check on him for about 3 hours. the guards falsified related records. 2 cameras in front of Epstein's cell also malfunctioned that night. Epstein was found dead in his cell at Metropolitan Correction Center in New York City at 6:30 Eastern Daylight Time on August 10th, 2019. Bureau of Prisons said life-saving measures were initiated immediately upon discovery of the body. He was taken to a hospital. On August 10th, 2019, Bureau of Prisons and U.S. Attorney General William Barr, who I'm going to pause here and remind you that Bill Barr's father is the one that hired Jeffrey Epstein, apparently without qualifications, to teach at the Dalton School as his first seemingly real professional experience. Again, just let that linger. Called the death an apparent suicide, although no final determination had been made. U.S. Department of Justice Inspector General's investigative report, released on June 27, 2023, criticized jail officials for repeated negligence, misconduct, and outright job performance failures in connection with Epstein's incarceration and death. It also denied the suggestion that what happened was anything other than a suicide. In May 2025, FBI announced plans to release surveillance footage from the night of Jeffrey Epstein's death, aiming to address the ongoing conspiracy theories. Deputy Director Dan Bongino stated that the video clearly shows Epstein alone in his cell with no evidence of outside involvement, reaffirming the official ruling of suicide, which, once again, this has been undermined by the minute plus that's missing from the footage from basically 11:58 to about 12 o'clock that night. And again, procedures. He was supposed to have a cellmate. Guard is supposed to look in his cell every 30 minutes. And it says they didn't check on him for 3 hours, but he was found dead at 6:30 in the morning. So, you tell me. Now, let's go to the autopsy part. Autopsy. August 11, 2019, an autopsy was performed. It appeared likely that Epstein had thrown himself violently off the cell's top bunk, which would explain the damage he suffered other than strangulation. Preliminary result of the autopsy found Epstein sustained multiple breaks in his neck bones. Among the bones broken in Epstein's neck was the hyoid bone. Such breaks of the hyoid bone can occur from those who hang themselves from some substantial height, e.g. jumping from a chair into the rope, but they are more common in victims of homicide by strangulation. I'm going to pause here before I read through the studies on this. The injury, the breaking of the hyoid bone, is more common in victims of homicide by strangulation than it is in victims of hanging. 2010 study found that broken hyoids in 25% of cases of hangings, but a larger study conducted from 2010 to 2016 found hyoid damage in just 16 of 264, or 6% of cases of hanging. Hyoid bone breaks become more common with age as the bones become more brittle. Forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht noted that hanging by leaning forward would not result in broken cervical bones. So, on August 16, 2019, Barbara Sampson, the New York City's medical examiner, ruled Epstein's death a suicide by hanging. The medical examiner, according to Epstein's defense counsel, only saw 9 minutes of footage from one security camera to help her arrive at her conclusion. So again, the guards were asleep, not checking on him. This lady saw 9 minutes of security footage to help her arrive at her conclusion. And essentially, the reason why we know about this stuff is Jeffrey Epstein's defense lawyers were not satisfied with the conclusion of the medical examiner and were conducting their own independent investigation into the cause of Epstein's death, including taking legal action if necessary to view the pivotal camera footage near his cell during the night of his death. Epstein's lawyers said that the evidence concerning Epstein's death was far more consistent with murder than suicide. Michael Baden, an independent pathologist hired by the Epstein estate, observed the autopsy. In 2019, Baden said that Epstein had experienced a number of injuries, among them a broken bone in the neck, that are extremely unusual in suicidal hangings and could occur much more commonly in homicidal strangulation. Baden thinks that the evidence points to homicide rather than suicide. And as one sort of final note, Jeffrey Epstein signed his last will and testament on August 8th, 2019, 2 weeks after being found injured in his cell and 2 days before his death. Until this time, Epstein had been depositing money in other inmates' commissary accounts to avoid being attacked. If you ever heard about it, I don't think people in prison tend to appreciate sexual predators, especially child sexual predators. Signing of the will was witnessed by 2 attorneys who knew him. The will named 2 longtime employees as executors and immediately gifted all his assets and the assets remaining in his estate to a trust. So again, what's important here is the following. Number one, the evidence that Jeffrey Epstein was potentially murdered in prison, a lot of that evidence is being propounded by Jeffrey Epstein's own defense team. So you do have to take it with a grain of salt. However, you have to follow the evidence. If the broken bone in his neck is more consistent with him being strangled, then it remains an open question as to whether or not he was strangled. And the idea of people just getting away with being able to blasé say, well, he killed himself in prison. Like, oh, did you see that? Was that visible through the shut door of his cell? Somehow I doubt that. I don't think that you actually saw that, and therefore, it's essentially unclear how all this happened. So again, to go back to the original point, why would anybody care about this? When the prison guards essentially fall asleep, out of order, against procedure, don't check in on him, and then all of a sudden, this guy winds up dead under circumstances that from a physical perspective would indicate that he was murdered, and that he had signed his last will and testament 2 days before, so after he had apparently tried this before. You're going to tell me that there's nothing going on here, that this guy wasn't trying to avoid his trial or whatever, essentially, the confident asserting of facts regarding these circumstances is what I find problematic, right? When the pathologist and the autopsy people tell you what bones were and were not broken, you can take those as fact. But then putting the information together to say, okay, well, he has an injury that certainly makes it appear that he was strangled. However, from a logical perspective, it doesn't rule out suicide by hanging. It just makes it seemingly, from a statistical perspective, much less likely. Again, you could kind of point to the fact that he already tried this once and didn't succeed, and the argument would essentially be that he was successful the second time. Again, that sort of thing beggars explanation, and again, so part of why this has become a more pressing issue right now is that, so the people who are running the Department of Justice and the FBI right now, the people running the FBI are conspiracy theorists, first and foremost. These are podcasters, conspiracy theorists, who are essentially making wild assertions about what the FBI did and did not have in terms of evidence, all while they were outside of government. Then once they get into government, they're acting so bizarrely that it's frankly difficult to take them seriously to any degree whatsoever. And then you have Pam Bondi, who said, and I do believe that the news stories are slightly misstating how she put this. It's only the fact that she said this more than once, including on Fox News, but talking about how a list of files relating to Jeffrey Epstein was sitting on my desk for review. Now, Elon, the jackass Musk, has alleged that Trump himself is in the Epstein files. To that, I would say, what evidence does Elon Musk have of this? And, the long and short of it would be, if Elon Musk had any actual evidence, it's likely that he didn't have or that he didn't legitimately have access to it, because what legitimate purpose could he have possibly had to have gotten such sensitive information? He was in charge of Doge. What does that have anything to do with, the Department of Justice's investigation into, Jeffrey Epstein? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's ridiculous. And so, but anyway, then, Pam Bondi's also done other stunts, like sending out those MAGA podcasters with the binders that said Epstein Files Phase 1. Then everybody who looked at them basically said that they had already been aware of all of that information. There was nothing new, and that basically this was done, or if it had been done by Democrats, they said it would have been viewed as an attempt to embarrass the people who were brought there, which kind of raises the question of why they would even do that. But then to have Pam Bondi and them come out essentially in the last week or two and say, more or less, Jeffrey Epstein didn't have a client list, didn't have a list of people he was blackmailing, etc., and that there's basically nothing to see here, it's time to move on. To that, I would say, I don't think so. And the reason I say I don't think so is, again, from the financial perspective, where did this guy's money come from? How much money did he have? Why did he have this money? You're telling me he didn't have client lists, and then I can read pretty easily on Wikipedia that he was a corporate raider involved with, Ponzi schemes, and that he was essentially a bounty hunter for rich people. Now you're going to sit there and tell me he didn't have a client list, and that this guy belonged to intelligence, was above Alexander Acosta's pay grade, and that he was told to leave it alone, and you're trying to tell me that there's nothing going on here. That's literally unbelievable, in the sense that if you believe that off rip, I honestly admire your naivete, because you're clearly not a knowledgeable person. Anybody knowledgeable would say this series of facts simply does not add up. And I'm going to sort of finish on this, but I have a saying, which I don't believe I invented this, but I use it, and it's a sort of orientation for the way I think of things, and it's essentially kind of a restating of the points of Occam's razor. But what I like to say is, 2 + 2 = 4. And so whenever we're considering matters like this, or giving consideration to this, that, and the other thing, we always need to make sure that at the end of the day, when we're doing our analysis, that 2 + 2 still equals 4. That we don't come with bullshit analyses where essentially it's like, today, Jupiter was in retrograde, and therefore 2 + 2 actually equals, 5 or some shit, because, and, you look in the world of business, and 2 + 2 does equal 5 because of interest, apparently. But, that notwithstanding, I think when we're doing analysis of anything, we need to be logical. We need to think about things from a perspective where, when things don't add up and don't make sense, we don't have to believe it just because the government said so. Just because Pam Bondi decided to spike this case, and then Donald Trump You know, you make your own decisions about how suspicious and bizarre his statements about this over the past week and a week and a half have been. If you don't think they're bizarre, I don't know what's wrong with you. But again, you know, I've basically completely glossed over that because it's seemingly such a minor footnote. But you talk about corruption, self-dealing, which are sort of the hallmarks of the current Trump administration, and you say, why would I trust literally anything that the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Commerce Department, literally any of these agencies, I don't trust them any farther than I can throw them. And so if they're going to say things that are just apparently ridiculous, just look at the facts. Their own constituents don't believe them. just look at that. Like, you know, the MAGA base is not buying this. And you can see that in all the videos. And I'm not a fan of Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson and all these people. But if you hear those crowds that they were talking to, you know for a fact that there are a lot of American people who are curious about this. And I think essentially the main reason they're curious is this. Why do these monopoly figures get to run around with amounts of money that essentially sound fake and imaginary to anybody living a normal life? And then why we essentially let these people run around as depraved criminals and treat them as if they're subject to a system of justice that's significantly more lenient than the system of justice that's being applied to regular people. I think there's real reason for the American people to ask those questions. I think any politician trying to hide from that or overshadow that or tell everybody, don't look over there, don't look behind the curtain, you marked yourself as being even more suspicious. And so I don't even need to go into the fact that Donald Trump is literally on record as saying that Jeffrey Epstein likes his girls and he likes them young. You know what I'm saying? I don't even need to address the fact that him and Jeffrey Epstein were closely associated for a decade plus. I don't even need to go over that. That's a matter of public record. There's videos of that. Go watch it. And then if you're going to watch those videos and then essentially say, oh, you know, I'm cool with it though. You know, it's Trump. Like, it's all good. I know he's not corrupt. Yeah, if you think that, you're a mark. You're a mark, and you belong in the swamp with Trump. And I encourage you to go join him because I'm telling you, someday there's going to be a reckoning for this. And I tell you what, if I was in power and I had the ability to release these records, and somebody is trying to tell me, well, no, Alex, like, you can't do that. John Kerry's on the list. Can't besmirch a Massachusetts politician. Like, let me tell you something right now. I don't give a fuck. If it was him, if it was Bill Clinton himself, Donald Trump, any of these people, Les Wexner, whoever these people are, I don't give a shit. And no amount of money should allow these people to run around as sexual predators. And if this guy is blackmailing people, or if he was an intelligence agent of any sort, whether it was an asset or an actual agent, again, these are things that are not to be dismissed. These are the sort of things that long ago would have been dismissed as conspiracy theories, but unfortunately, after the government lied about Vietnam, lied about the war in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, everything else, they don't have any credibility left anymore to say things that are not believable. And you can make your own assessment of it. But again, if you're just Charlie Kirk style, you know, I'm listening to my friends in the administration and I'm not going to open my mind to any possibilities or think logically at all, you're a mark. That's all you are. You're a mark and you're not worthy of anybody's respect. So that's it. That's Pod45. I may be back at some point doing these, but I'm not going to lie. These are not necessarily worth the time, but when I get an idea like this, I'm going to roll with it, and I think this was worth the time. All right.